The Belgian colonizers had a name for them, enfants de la honte, children of shame. From 1908 to 1960, between 15 and 20,000 mixed-race children were systematically removed from the Belgian Congo, torn from their African mothers' arms by colonial authorities, who meticulously documented every abduction with chilling bureaucratic precision. The Belgian government sealed these records for decades, hidden in Brussels' basement archives, stamped classified, until 2017. This wasn't a secret whispered in shadows, it was a secret locked in filing cabinets, preserved in stamped documents, codified in official policies written in meticulous French cursive. The mothers searching for their stolen children heard the same phrase repeatedly: "It's for their own good." But whose good exactly? Before we dive into Marie-Therese Kana's story and the children who vanished into Katanga Province's Catholic missions, make sure to subscribe to this channel. What you're about to witness is documented horror that most history books conveniently omit. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. This story deserves to be heard worldwide. What makes this particularly chilling isn't that it was hidden, it's that it was written down. Approved by committees. Executed with the same efficiency Belgium used to extract rubber and copper from Congolese soil. This wasn't the work of rogue individuals. This was systematic, institutionalized child removal, designed to maintain colonial order at the expense of human dignity and the most fundamental bond in existence. The meticulous record-keeping, the cold detached language of decrees, the unwavering conviction of those implementing them, it paints a picture of horror far more insidious than overt violence. This was the violence of erasure. Cruelty disguised as charity and progress. Elizabethville, now Lubumbashi, sprawled across copper-rich Katanga province like a European fantasy imposed on African savanna. By 1923, it had become the colonial jewel of Belgian Congo. Wide boulevards lined with imported South American jacaranda trees, their purple blossoms contrasting starkly with the red dust coating everything. Administrative buildings constructed with European arrogance that assumed permanence, boasted grand facades and cool tiled interiors. This city was built on Congolese sweat and blood, designed to serve Belgian crown interests and Union Miniere du Katanga, the powerful mining conglomerate extracting vast quantities of copper, cobalt, and uranium. The city was surgically divided, a physical manifestation of racial hierarchy governing every aspect of life. The European Quarter, with manicured gardens, tennis courts, and social clubs, occupied elevated ground where breezes were coolest. Here, Belgian families lived in relative luxury, attended by African servants. Below sprawled the site indigene, the native quarter, a labyrinth of unpaved streets, crowded mud, brick houses, and rudimentary markets. A world separated by invisible but impenetrable barriers of race and power. Marie-Therese Kana worked as domestic servant in the home of Albert de Samps, a mining engineer from Liege, who'd arrived in Elizabethville in 1920 with a wife, 2 children, and ambitions exceeding his modest position with Union Miniere. She was 19, daughter of a Luba chief who'd sent her to Catholic mission school, where she learned to read French, embroider linens, and believe education would be her path to a better life. Instead, it led her to de Samps' household, where she scrubbed floors, prepared meals, and tried remaining invisible. Colonial households made invisibility impossible for young African women. They existed in a strange quantum state, simultaneously beneath notice and under constant scrutiny. Their bodies considered both inferior and available. Their humanity acknowledged just enough to make them useful, never enough to grant protection. Marie-Therese moved through the de Samps' home with quiet dignity. Eyes downcast, movements precise, she understood unspoken rules: never meet European gazes directly, speak only when spoken to, anticipate every need, yet beneath her composed exterior, quiet resentment simmered. She'd been taught to aspire, to believe in education's promise, only to find herself trapped in different servitude. Albert Desamps was unremarkable in features, but inflated with self-importance that grew with each year in Congo. He saw his African staff, not as individuals, but as household extensions tools, ensuring his comfort. His wife Marguerite was a woman of sharp angles and sharper opinions, meticulously maintaining European civility's illusion in Africa's heart. She presided with perpetual dissatisfaction, constantly finding fault, constantly reminding servants of perceived shortcomings. She was particularly vigilant about maintaining racial boundaries, a silent guardian of colonial order within her own home. By March 1924, Marie-Therese was pregnant. The subtle changes, the morning sickness she desperately tried concealing, nothing escaped Marguerite's notice. Marguerite Desamps noticed first, the way women always notice, and her reaction wasn't shock but cold, calculated fury. Not fury at her husband, of course. That would require acknowledging what everyone in the European quarter already knew, but never discussed. Belgian men routinely impregnated their African servants, and these pregnancies represented not moral failing, but logistical problems. Acknowledging Albert's culpability would disrupt the carefully constructed facade of European moral superiority. Easier and more convenient to blame the African woman, frame her as temptress, instigator, the problem's source. The problem, as colonial administration saw it, was the children. Mixed race children, Metis, as officially classified, disrupted colonial order. They were living evidence of intimacy across the color line. Proof that racial hierarchies Belgium constructed were permeable, vulnerable, ultimately artificial. Their very existence challenged the notion of a clear, unbridgeable divide between colonizer and colonized. More practically, they complicated inheritance laws, raised uncomfortable questions about paternity, threatened to create a class belonging fully to neither world, potential sources of instability and dissent. The Belgians, obsessed with order and control, could not tolerate such ambiguity. The solution was characteristically bureaucratic: removal, relocation, re-education. Children would be taken from African mothers and placed in Catholic missions specifically established for Metis children, where they'd be raised as Europeans, or at least as European as their mixed blood would allow. Mothers would be compensated with small payments and assurances their children were receiving opportunities they could never provide. Fathers would be absolved of responsibility, their reputations protected. Colonial order would remain intact, its fragile racial purity preserved. Marie-Therese gave birth to a daughter on November 3, 1924, in the native hospital where Congolese women delivered babies on metal tables under supervision of a single overworked Flemish nurse. The air was thick with antiseptic smell and fear, newborn cries echoing in sterile corridors. She named her daughter Celeste, after the mission school teacher who'd been kind to her, a woman who'd once offered a glimmer of hope. For 3 months, she kept the baby hidden in servants' quarters behind the cookhouse, a small, cramped room with a single window overlooking the dusty backyard. She nursed her in dark hours before dawn, heart a constant drum of anxiety, singing lullabies in whispers, trying to imprint every detail of her daughter's tiny face onto her memory. But you cannot hide a baby forever, especially not in a colonial city where every African's movements were monitored, documented, controlled. The whispers began, subtle glances, questions from other servants, only a matter of time before Celeste's problem would be officially addressed. The men came on a Tuesday morning in February 1925, when jacaranda trees were blooming, their purple petals littering red earth, and the air smelled like copper dust from distant mines. 3 of them, Father Gustave Leclerc from Mission de Saint Joseph, a territorial agent named Pieter Vandenberg, and a Congolese policeman whose name Marita Ease never learned, but whose face she'd remember forever, young, perhaps 25. His expression carefully neutral as he stood behind the two white men. They had papers. Father Leclerc, a gaunt man with thin lips and eyes holding perpetual judgment, held them carefully, as if the documents themselves were sacred objects imbued with divine authority. He explained in slow, deliberate French, voice devoid of warmth, that Celeste had been classified as Medi's child under Colonial Decree 1523 of 1920. This decree granted the state authority to remove mixed trace children from their mother's custody if the father was European, and the mother deemed incapable of providing appropriate upbringing. The words were a torrent of bureaucratic euphemisms, a legalistic shield for profound cruelty. The decree had been written in Brussels by men who'd never set foot in Africa, approved by a colonial minister who believed he was solving a problem, implemented by priests who believed they were saving souls. Marita Ease understood perhaps half of what Father Leclerc said. Her mission school French was adequate for household instructions and market transactions, not legal terminology and convoluted colonial policy justifications. What she understood completely, however, was the gesture Vandenberg made toward the baby in her arms. Pieter Vandenberg extended a hand, a silent command. His cold blue eyes held no empathy, only detached efficiency of a man performing a duty. She ran, not far. There was nowhere to run in a colonial city where every street led back to European authority. But she ran far enough to make them chase her through servants' quarters, past the outdoor kitchen where the cook was preparing breakfast, her eyes wide with silent horror. Marita Ease burst into the narrow alley behind the property where laundry hung on lines, flapping like distressed flags, and chickens scattered, squawking in protest. She made it perhaps 50 meters, bare feet pounding dusty ground. Celeste clutched tightly to her chest before the Congolese policeman caught her. His hands were surprisingly gentle as he gripped her arms, his voice low and urgent in Swahili, a language the white men didn't understand. "Don't make this worse. They'll take her anyway. Don't make them hurt you too." His eyes, though neutral, held a flicker of something Marita Ease recognized: resignation, a shared understanding of powerlessness. The sound Marita Ease made when they pulled Celeste from her arms wasn't quite a scream. It was something deeper, more primal, a sound that came from a place beyond language, a tearing of the soul. The cook would later tell other servants she'd never heard anything like it, that it sounded like something breaking that could never be repaired, a sound that would haunt her dreams for years. Father Leclerc held the baby awkwardly, his arm stiff, unused to infants, while Vandenberg produced another document, a receipt, essentially acknowledging that one Medi's female child, approximately 3 months old, had been transferred from Marita Ease's custody to Mission St. Joseph for proper Christian upbringing. He offered her a pen to sign. When she refused, hands trembling too violently to hold it, he signed it himself, marking her signature line with an X as if her illiteracy was assumed, her consent irrelevant, her very existence a mere formality in their bureaucratic process. They paid her 200 francs. Vandenberg counted the bills carefully, placed them in her hand, closed her fingers around them with a gesture that might have been meant as kindness or perhaps just a final dismissive act. The money represented approximately 2 months of her wages as domestic servant. The colonial administration had calculated the value of a mother's child with the same cold precision they used to calculate extracted copper ore's value. It was a transaction, a purchase, a final insult. The entire transaction took less than 15 minutes. By the time Marguerite de Samps emerged from the main house to see what the commotion was about, The men were already walking back toward their vehicle, a black Ford truck with Administration Territorial painted on the side, its engine idling impatiently. Marie-Therese was on her knees in red dust, the 200 francs scattered around her like fallen jacaranda petals, making that terrible sound that was not quite crying and not quite screaming, but something worse than either, a sound of utter desolation. What Marguerite de Samps did next would be remembered by household staff for years afterward, a chilling testament to colonial systems' casual cruelty. She walked past Marie-Therese without a word, face a mask of indifference, went back into the house and rang the bell for morning tea, as if nothing unusual had occurred. As if the removal of an African woman's child was so ordinary, so expected, so utterly unremarkable that it didn't even merit acknowledgement. And in a sense, she was right. This wasn't unusual. This was policy. This was the quiet, bureaucratic horror of Belgian Congo. Mission de Saint-Joseph sat 15 kilometers outside Elizabethville, a cluster of whitewashed buildings baking under relentless Katangan sun, accessible only by a rutted dirt road that became impassable quagmire during rainy season, effectively isolating it from the city. The mission had been established in 1922 specifically to house Métis children, funded by colonial government subsidies and donations from Belgian Catholic organizations believing they were supporting civilizing work in darkest Africa. By 1925, it housed 43 children ranging in age from infants to 12-year-olds, all of them light-skinned enough to mark them as mixed race, all of them separated from their mothers under Colonial Decree 1523's authority. The children were given new names. Celeste Kana became Celeste de Samps. Fathers' surnames were used whether fathers acknowledged paternity or not, a perverse form of recognition. Her birth records were amended to list her place of birth as the mission itself, as if she'd materialized there spontaneously without a mother, without history, without a past connecting her to the Congolese world her mother inhabited. It was systematic erasure, a bureaucratic act of cultural genocide. Father Leclerc ran the mission with rigid discipline of a man believing African blood was contamination that could be diluted through education, prayer, and strict adherence to European customs. He saw himself as a shepherd guiding lost lambs to salvation, purifying them of their primitive heritage. The children spoke only French. Congolese languages were forbidden, punished with hours of kneeling on dried corn kernels in the chapel, painful reminders of their savage tongues. They ate with forks and knives, wore shoes even in brutal heat, learned Belgian history and Catholic catechism, and were taught that their mothers had given them up willingly out of love because they wanted their children to have better lives, to escape poverty and ignorance of their native villages. It was a narrative carefully constructed to sever the most fundamental of human bonds. Some older children remembered their mothers. They whispered about them at night in dormitories, sharing fragmented memories of lullabies and smells and the feeling of being held. But the younger ones, the ones taken as infants like Celeste, grew up believing the mission was their only home, the priests and nuns their only family. Belgium, a distant motherland they'd never seen, was taught to be revered as the source of all good. Their identities were forged in a vacuum, disconnected from their true origins. Marie-Therese tried to visit. The first time she walked the 15 kilometers in early morning, feet already aching, arriving at mission gates as the sun climbed toward its zenith, casting long, distorted shadows. A Flemish nun named Sister Margaretha met her at the entrance. The mission was surrounded by a high wall topped with broken glass, ostensibly to keep wild animals out, but functionally to keep the children in and unauthorized visitors away. Sister Margaretha explained in the patient, condescending tone one uses with children or the simple-minded that visits from biological mothers weren't permitted. The children were adjusting to their new lives. Contact with their past would only confuse them, make the transition more difficult. It was better this way, cleaner, more efficient. Marie-Therese came back the next week and the week after that. Each time she was turned away, the same polite but firm refusal, the same cold logic. On her fourth visit, Father Leclerc himself came to the gate. He was less patient than Sister Margareta, his French clipped and cold, eyes narrowed with irritation. He informed her that if she continued disturbing the mission, he'd report her to territorial administration for harassment. There were laws about this sort of thing. She could be arrested, fined, possibly imprisoned. Did she understand? She understood. She understood the threat, the power imbalance, the futility of her pleas. She stopped coming to the gate, but she didn't stop coming to the mission. Instead, she began walking the perimeter of the wall slowly, methodically, looking for gaps, for places where she might see inside, might catch a glimpse of a child who might be her daughter. The mission children played in a courtyard visible from a section of wall where the ground rose slightly. If you stood in exactly the right spot, balanced precariously on a termite mound, you could see over the broken glass to where the children ran and played under watchful supervision of nuns. Marie-Therese went there every Sunday afternoon when the children had recreation time. She watched them for hours, heart a raw wound, trying to identify Celeste among the lights, kin children in identical white dresses. But infant faces change quickly, and she'd only had 3 months to memorize her daughter's features. After a while, she couldn't be certain which child was hers. Maybe the girl with the round face. Maybe the one who laughed loudly. Maybe none of them. Maybe Celeste had been transferred to another mission. Other mothers came too. Marie-Therese wasn't alone in her vigil. There was Josephine, whose son Petrus had been taken when he was 2. There was Amina, a quiet woman from a village near the Lualaba River, who'd given birth to twins, both removed, both given to the mission. There was Beatrice, who'd worked for a Belgian doctor and been dismissed immediately after her daughter Sylvie was taken. They stood together on that termite mound these women deemed unfit to raise their own children, faces etched with shared grief. And they watched the mission courtyard like it was a window into a world they were no longer permitted to enter. The colonial administration didn't see this as cruelty. They saw it as progress. In Brussels, officials wrote reports about the Metis program, praising its efficiency, its humanitarian goals, its success in preventing formation of a problematic mixed race underclass. The children were being saved from lives of poverty and confusion, raised as Christians, educated as Europeans. Their mothers were being spared the burden of children they couldn't properly care for. Everyone benefited. The system worked. It was a perfect self-justifying machine of human separation. But systems built on the premise that some people's children belong to the state have a way of expanding, finding new categories of children who need saving, new reasons why mothers are unfit, new justifications for separation. By 1930, Mission de Saint Joseph housed over 100 children. By 1935, there were 3 more missions established across Katanga province alone, each dedicated to the same purpose, each a silent monument to stolen childhoods. The program was expanding, systematizing, becoming more efficient. The colonial government began requiring all Metis children to be registered at birth, their mothers identified, their fathers documented when possible. Territorial agents were given quotas. Not officially, of course, but everyone understood that finding and removing Metis children was part of their job performance, a metric by which their dedication to colonial order was measured. Marie-Therese, who'd once believed education would save her, who'd trusted the priests and mission school promises, learned a different lesson entirely. The same institutions that taught her to read and write could also teach her that her love for her child mattered less than colonial policy, that her motherhood was conditional, revocable, subject to approval of men who'd never see her as fully human. She kept the 200 francs, never spent them. She kept them in a small cloth bag hidden under floorboards of whatever room she was living in, moving them with her when she changed employment, when she moved from one household to another, when she eventually left Elizabethville entirely. The bills grew soft with age, the ink fading, but she kept them anyway as evidence, as proof, as a reminder of the price the Belgian government had placed on her daughter. If this story is making you realize how much hidden history exists, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Hit that like button to support this content and subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Let's uncover what happens next together. In 1936, something shifted. A subtle tremor in Mission de Saint Joseph's rigid structure. Father Leclerc, whose stern countenance had become synonymous with the mission's unyielding discipline, was replaced by a younger priest, Father Antoine Dubois. Dubois had arrived from Belgium with different ideas about the Medes program. A quiet unease stirred within him about the moral implications of their work. He'd studied theology at Leuven, a university known for progressive intellectual currents, and written his dissertation on the moral obligations of colonial powers toward indigenous populations, a topic earning him both praise from progressive Catholic intellectuals and suspicion from colonial administration, which didn't particularly want priests asking uncomfortable questions about their policy's morality. Dubois was meticulous, but his meticulousness served a different purpose. He began keeping different records. In addition to official documentation required by colonial government, names, ages, dates of admission, fathers' identities, when known, he started a private ledger, a small leather-bound book he kept hidden in his desk. In this ledger, he recorded the children's stories, their fragmented memories, their unspoken fears. He interviewed older children, the ones who remembered their mothers, and wrote down what they told him in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously. He noted which children cried at night, which ones asked about their families, which ones had stopped asking because they'd learned questions about their mothers were discouraged, redirected, or punished with extra prayers and additional chores. He saw the psychological toll of this enforced amnesia, the quiet desperation beneath the surface of their carefully constructed European identities. He also began documenting something else, something far more disturbing. The children were disappearing. Not all of them, and not obviously, but gradually, systematically. Certain children were being transferred away from the mission with minimal documentation and no explanation. Official records would note transferred to Belgium for continued education, or placed with approved family, or simply relocated. But when Dubois tried to follow up, to find out where these children had gone, he encountered bureaucratic walls, polite but firm refusal to provide details. Colonial administration told him it wasn't his concern. The children were being given opportunities. He should be grateful Belgian families were willing to take them in, to offer them better lives. But Dubois wasn't grateful. He was suspicious because the children who disappeared were always the lightest skinned ones, the ones who could most easily pass as European, the ones whose African heritage was least visible. And the families they were supposedly placed with never visited, never wrote, never sent photographs or updates. The children simply vanished into Belgium, into a country most had never seen, to live with families whose names Dubois wasn't permitted to know. It was as if they'd ceased to exist, their past erased, their future a blank slate dictated by colonial policy. He started writing letters to the colonial ministry in Brussels, to Catholic organizations in Belgium, to other priests running similar missions across Congo. He asked questions carefully phrased but insistent. Where were the children going? Who were these families? What happened to the children after they arrived in Belgium? Were they adopted legally? Were they being treated well? Did they maintain any connection to their Congolese heritage, to their mothers, to their identities? Most of his letters went unanswered. The few responses he received were vague, bureaucratic, designed to provide information without actually revealing anything. One letter from a colonial official in Brussels was more direct, a thinly veiled warning. Father Dubois, your concern for these children is admirable, but you must understand that the Metis program serves a larger purpose. These children are being given opportunities their mothers could never provide. Your role is to prepare them for European life, not to question the wisdom of the policies that govern their futures. I trust you will focus on your duties and leave administrative matters to those qualified to handle them. The letter was dated April 12, 1937, signed by Henry Jaspar, Director of Native Affairs for Belgian Congo. Dubois kept it in his private ledger along with all the other documentation. He was accumulating a growing archive of evidence that something deeply wrong was happening, even if he couldn't yet articulate exactly what or the full extent of its horror. Meanwhile, Marie-Therese had not given up. She'd left the Desamps household in 1926, unable to continue working in the place where her daughter had been taken. The memories too painful, too raw. She found employment with other European families, moving through a series of positions, always dismissed after a few months or a year, when her employers grew tired of her silence, her sadness, her inability to perform cheerfulness. Her grief was an inconvenient truth in their carefully constructed world. By 1937, she was working for a Belgian accountant named Louis Vermeer, a widower with no children who needed someone to manage his household, and didn't particularly care about her emotional state as long as his meals were prepared and his clothes were clean. Vermeer was different from other Belgians Marie-Therese had worked for. He was older, perhaps 60, his face lined with years spent under the African sun, and he'd lived in Congo for over 20 years. He spoke Swahili fluently, treated his Congolese employees with brusque respect that was unusual among Europeans, and kept to himself, spending evenings reading or working on accounting ledgers he brought home from the mining company. He was a man of numbers, of facts, of quiet observation. He noticed that Marie-Therese went out every Sunday afternoon, always in the same direction, always returning after dark, her face a little more drawn, a little more tired. He never asked where she went, but one Sunday in June 1937, curiosity overriding his usual reserve, he followed her. He watched her walk to the mission wall, climb onto the termite mound, and stand there for hours watching the children play in the courtyard. He saw the other women who joined her, saw how they stood together in silence, a community of shared sorrow, saw how they left when the sun began to set, walking back toward the city in a loose group, their faces carefully blank, their grief a private burden. The next morning, over breakfast, Vermeer asked Marie-Therese a single question, his voice low, devoid of judgment. "Which one is yours?" She looked at him for a long moment, eyes searching his, trying to determine if this was a trap, if answering would lead to punishment or dismissal. 12 years of colonial employment had taught her caution, that European kindness usually came with conditions, with expectations, with prices not named upfront. Finally, she said in careful French, voice barely a whisper, "I do not know anymore. They all look the same in those dresses. I think maybe the tall one with the dark hair, but I am not certain." The admission was a fresh wound. The uncertainty, a constant torment. Vermeer nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. Then he said something that would change everything. A simple offer that held the weight of a lifetime of unspoken pain. "I know someone at the Colonial Archives. If you want, I can find out what happened to your daughter, where she is, if she's still at the mission, or if she was sent somewhere else." It was a lifeline offered unexpectedly in a world that had offered her only despair. Marie-Therese, despite her ingrained distrust, knew that this might be her only chance to find out what had happened to Celeste. So she nodded once, a single decisive movement, and said, "Yes, please." It took Vermeer 3 weeks to get the information. To be continued. This is documented history. These are real lives, real mothers, real children. Share this video to ensure these stories are never forgotten. Subscribe for the continuation of Marie Therese's search for Celeste.